Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our seminar on the legacy of Whitlam. A few housekeeping matters before we start. The toilets are up the back, and there's plenty of food over there. We'll break after John has spoken, so we'll have a break and then people can have cups of tea, etc. My first job is to introduce Bob Anderson. Bob is a life member of the Brisbane Labour History Association, and he will perform Welcome to Country.
Right. I ain't showing up where either. This is not a new experience for me. Oh, come on, say, I can win it from here, can I? Yep. Can you hear me all right? You're going in an army, too, maybe, Rano. Going in an army. Welcome to this land of the Jaguar, land of the Turrbal people. It's a pleasure for me to do that, and it's a pleasure for me to be with some of the old hands, you might say. I always use the point of view that being a member of the Labor Party is like being a Catholic. It's a life sentence. So I've been all of those things, and once you're committed to it, it's a lifetime sentence. So we all enjoy, we all suffer likewise, but as we say, you're walking together makes us strength, and we pass on the baton to the younger generation when they're coming through. I see Rod Elford here, so yeah, we know each other way back for all the right reasons too. So, and Senator Claire Moore has been walking the beat also for all those years. It's like we regard ourselves pretty well as being the elders or the seniors in the Labour movement. So it's a pleasure for Kathy and I to be here to share the time with you and enjoy a bit of a chat later over a glass or two. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to introduce Claire Moore. Claire Moore is also a life member of the Brisbane Labour History Association. She's a leading member of the Workers' Heritage Centre and chair of the United Nations Association. So, Claire, thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and hello everyone, and thank you as always, Bob. I'm not quite sure. The word senior worries me just a bit. My job was to introduce John Faulkner, and there's no necessity to do that. Everyone in this room knows John. He has been incredibly generous to come and share his time with us. As you would expect, at this time, around the 50th anniversary, everyone wants John Faulkner to come and talk about Whitlam, the legacy, and the whole profile with them. And he really worked hard to come and join with us tonight, so it's a pleasure. He was a minister, the leader of the government, the leader of the opposition in the Senate, but still I think many of us up here know his generosity to Queensland, and I think most people in the room would have attended one of the legendary Faulkner trivia nights. Can everyone who has attended a Faulkner trivia night put their hand up? I'm sure there's more of you, but that's right. Thank you very much, John. You're on.
Well, thanks, Claire. Tell me if this is not a very clear microphone, and I'll ditch it. Well, I've attended about 350 John Faulkner trivia nights, and it's more than enough. But let me begin by thanking you, Uncle Bob, and also acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, and by paying my respects to elders past and present. Well, friends, Gough Whitlam dedicated his very long and distinguished public life to a grand vision for our nation. It became the centrepiece of his policy speech to launch the 1972 federal election campaign, delivered precisely 50 years and 3 weeks ago today. And that grand vision was to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. And he was also clear about how to make that vision a reality. From his first political involvement as a young RAAF navigator in World War II, eager to see John Curtin's governments granted wider post-war reconstruction powers, until his death 8 years ago last Friday, Gough Whitlam believed in the principle that concrete improvements could be provided for the Australian people through legislative and constitutional reform. And he was a tireless advocate for the reforms he believed in, and for the more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia that he wanted. And those are the values at the heart of the Whitlam legacy. And I hope that many Australians will be reminded of those values and that legacy in a matter of weeks now, as we celebrate the election of the Whitlam government on the 2nd of December 1972, 50 years ago. Much is going to be said about those times, of Gough, his ministers, his political opponents, the government's successes and failures, the strengths and weaknesses of both Gough and his government. However, no one will be able to challenge the fact that Gough Whitlam's towering figure dominated the Australian political scene in the mid-1960s, and it did so for over a decade. And no one should ever doubt the guts, the determination, the challenges he faced and met, the sheer hard work that was required to achieve that great victory in 1972. And astonishing as Whitlam's election victory in that year might have seemed to those used to long decades of federal Liberal government, that win was 20 years in the making, from the time that Gough Whitlam won the Werriwa by-election in 1952. And I'd say to you, friends, this evening, that change... There's a bit of change for you. That change in a country or in a society is a slow process. And change in a political party is particularly one that's grown comfortable in opposition, like the Labor Party grew comfortable in opposition in the 1960s. That can be a slow process too. In the Labor Party in those years, it was glacial. And this evening, because I'm speaking to a gathering of Labor stalwarts and comrades, I thought I would speak frankly to you about Gough's drive to make the Labor Party electable, and how that drive made victory in 1972 possible. So, first, some context. Gough, as I said, was elected to federal parliament in 1952. By 1954, internal tensions in the party were damaging and growing quickly, and they of course would lead to the split and the formation of the DLP. And the DLP would be a thorn in Labor's side for the next 20 years. And when Gough was elected deputy leader in 1960 and then leader of the party in 1967, the party was still struggling with those terrible consequences of the split. And what Gough did was set about revamping the party's policies, changing the party's culture and reforming its organisation. And I want to assure you that this was a very tough and complex and time-consuming and risky task. So I want to mention 5 events tonight, all occurring in the decade prior to Gough winning in 1972, that I think encapsulate the Labor Party of those years and the challenges that Gough faced and learned from and overcame. First, you all know about this one, the 36 Faceless Men, March 1963. There's Arthur Corwell and Gough Whitlam, the leader and deputy leader of the Federal Labor Party, photographed outside the Hotel Kingston in Canberra, while the Federal Conference of the Labor Party inside determined the party's foreign and defence policy. And that was exploited, as many of you would remember, mercilessly by Menzies in the 1963 federal election. And it mattered naught that on the key issue that was debated at the Federal Conference, which was the future of the North West Cape Defence Communications Base, actually the Corwell-Whitlam position was agreed very narrowly by the conference. But that didn't matter a damn. The damage was done, the evidence was clear. Labor's federal leaders were standing outside while others determined the party's policy that they were supposed to implement in government, determining that inside the building. And of course, remember this, all Gough wanted, because this is part of his character, all he wanted was the Labor leaders to be inside the room. He didn't want a majority, he just wanted them inside the room. Because as you know, Gough had a lot of confidence, a huge amount of self-confidence. He thought if he was in the room, he had the absolute confidence that he would be, by the strength of his own advocacy, able to convince those delegates what the appropriate response on those issues should be. Anyway, none of it happened. And Labor suffered as a result enormously, as you know. Second issue I wanted to raise was the 12 witless men of the party's federal executive. Now, just a year before Gough became leader, he broke with the party on the issue of state funding or public funding for non-government schools. And at the federal executive of the party, Gough's enemies used the opportunity to seek his expulsion from the party and destroy him once and for all. Gough took them on and famously said, "I can only say we've just got rid of the 36 faceless men stigma to be faced with the 12 witless men." Now, unsurprisingly, the 12 so-called witless men didn't like being called witless. They were all men, it's fair to say. But what happened, and there's a lot of luck in politics, no one should ever tell you there's not a lot of luck in politics, because meanwhile, up here in your fair state, an obscure country party MP by the name of George Shaw died. He'd served less than one most uneventful and unprepossessing term in the House of Representatives as the member for Dawson. But his death was going to save Gough Whitlam's political career. So as Gough's enemies rounded on him in Canberra, Gough flew to Mackay to campaign day and night with Rex Patterson in the resultant Dawson by-election. And Labor won it, very unexpectedly, but Labor won it on the 26th of February 1966. The swing, an amazing 11.5% swing to Labor, and everyone knew it was Whitlam's victory. Everyone knew it. But regardless, Gough was summoned to Canberra for his execution at the Federal Executive by the witless men. It was an emergency meeting held in early March. And he was close. He was very close. He beat the charge of gross disloyalty. He just escaped expulsion by 2 votes. And those 2 votes were the switch around of the 2 Queensland federal executive delegates, because they supported him in the afterglow of the Dawson by-election victory. That's politics. He wasn't expelled. He became leader of our party in 1967. And you know, electoral success through this whole difficult period is going to strengthen Whitlam's hand. It sure did on that occasion. So now Whitlam's leader. Let's move on to the Victorian, issue 3, the Victorian Party Conference of June 1967. And at that conference, Gough launched an all-guns blazing attack on the unrepresentative and rigid cabal that dominated the Victorian ALP. And he nailed them. He nailed his opponents. They decried compromise, and they made a fetish of ideological purity. Gough's retort, you would have heard it so many times, certainly the impotent are pure. Well, the response from the Victorians, he was heckled, he was drowned out, he was condemned, he was opposed. It was as tough as it gets in our party. But, and this is critical, at no stage did he take a backward step. He knew that it was essential that those state branches acting autocratically, undemocratically, capriciously or corruptly were cleaned up or cleaned out. And soon after the Victorian Conference, in July 1967, a by-election was held in the Victorian federal seat of Corio, which hadn't been held by Labor since Chifley's prime ministership. And it was Gough Whitlam's first electoral test as party leader. And to the amazement of the Victorian Central Executive, Gough's magnificent campaign there produced another win against the odds and against all expectations, another swing in excess of 11% two-party preferred in Corio. The fourth issue I thought I would share with you is the Harradine affair and Gough's resignation as party leader. We've moved on now to April 1968. Now, Brian Harradine, who sat in the Senate with a couple of us here. He was a Tasmanian delegate to the Labor Party's federal executive. And he was expected, not unsurprisingly at the time, of being an NCC operative and a supporter of the Democratic Labour Party. He had very strong, it was thought he had very strong links with them. Now, a majority of the federal executive of our party thought that Harradine was not a fit and proper person to serve on the executive and wouldn't seat him, wouldn't give him a vote, gave him no permission to attend as a member. And that's what the executive decided, narrowly again. But Gough, who supported Harradine, resigned the party leadership in protest, sought a renewed mandate from the caucus. He got it just. Jim Cairns accepted the challenge, stood for the leadership in the caucus, had a wonderful slogan, a very effective and asked a very effective and simple question. Whose party is this, ours or his? Well, 32 members of the caucus thought it was ours and 38 thought it was his. It was very close indeed. And let me say to you, I always thought Gough was absolutely wrong about Harradine. Quite wrong. Harradine was NCC. He should never have been a member of Labor's federal executive. Harradine did not deserve Gough Whitlam's support, and he didn't deserve to have Labor Party membership either. But I've also always believed that this was a turning point in the Whitlam leadership. There's no doubt about that. Because I think Gough learnt from two very serious miscalculations. The first, supporting Harradine. The second, resigning the leadership of the Labor Party. So he emerged victorious, as I said, just, but he emerged chastened, very chastened. The party remained intact, which wouldn't have happened in the 1950s. It didn't split. But what happened after that, soon after that, Gough's dominance starts to grow in the Labor Party, both in the development of a policy program for government and also in the party organisation. And then the party's 1969 federal conference was a policy triumph. A policy triumph for the party. Everyone accepted that. And then the 1969 election, which follows, was a very fine result. Yeah, we didn't win it, but we won 18 seats off the Liberals and Nationals. We won a majority, a clear majority of the two-party preferred vote, and we got a 7.2% swing. But there was a problem. And the problem remained, fortunately not my state of New South Wales or your state of Queensland, but it was Victoria. Victoria, where in the 1960s, think of this, particularly in the context of current politics, in the 1969 federal election, the Victorian vote for the Labor Party was 6% below the national average. And there were electoral tests coming up in Victoria in May 1970, both with the then Liberal Premier Bolte going to the polls, an electoral test on the same day in South Australia. And in Victoria, Sir Henry Bolte's Liberal government was really expected to struggle because Labor was on the move nationally. But Labor's Victorian Central Executive soon put paid to that. The Executive told the State Leader Clyde Holding what to do and opposed formally Federal Labor's position on state aid funding to needy non-government schools. It produced its own policy for Victoria, which was to phase out state aid. So you've got federal and state Labor at loggerheads. And Victorian leader Clyde Holding was humiliated. South Australian leader Don Dunstan, who gets over the line just, very hamstrung and embarrassed by the goings on in Victoria. But of course, Bolty just pounced. He just pounced. And what happened was that the Liberal government down there, expected to struggle, was actually re-elected with an increased majority. And for Gough, he believed it was crystal clear that Labor, by then 21 years out of office at the federal level, could neither win an election in Victoria or at the federal level without fundamental reform of the Victorian ALP. And that brings me to my fifth example, which is little known about, but it was the breakthrough in Broken Hill, a 4-day meeting of the Federal Executive in Broken Hill in August 1970. And the idea of this meeting was to consider, amongst other matters, the serious problems of the Victorian and New South Wales branches. And this was a hugely significant meeting. It's now unfortunately lost in the mists of time, but it's a wonderful story, and I'm just going to briefly share it with you. The key player at this particular meeting in support of Whitlam at this stage was Clyde Cameron from South Australia, obviously, as you know, later a minister in the Whitlam government, and ending with not a very strong relationship with Gough, as you probably are aware. But he was the key player, supported by fellow South Australians, new Premier Don Dunstan and Federal Secretary of the party, Mick Young. Now, Cameron was committed to cleaning up the Victorian branch, but he also made clear to his colleagues, and I think this is absolutely wonderful, I've got the quote here, he would only do that if he could, quote, take on the brief if it was expanded to include the extreme right-wing controlled New South Wales branch. Good on him. But look, this meeting is just epic. It's wonderful. To be fair, the New South Wales ALP leadership saw the writing on the wall, sensibly agreed to federal intervention, and as a result just got on with their watertight control of that state, which I can confirm, having been a delegate to conference just, I think it was a weekend ago, is still maintained. Anyway, but the Victorians and their allies fought Cameron and Gough tooth and nail, and this is what happened. The two most belligerent antagonists were the two Victorian delegates, Bill Brown, who was a senator, and State Secretary Bill Hartley. Yeah. And on an early morning stroll before the Federal Executive meeting commenced, Clyde Cameron and Mick Young happened on the Titanic Bandsman Memorial in Sturt Park in Broken Hill. It's the only such memorial in the world. And I recently spoke at a couple of years ago at the Broken Hill Trades Hall, and I went looking for it, this memorial, and there it is, in the park. There on the left-hand side of the memorial, they spy the name. I can assure you it's there. W. Hartley, Bandmaster. Now, apparently they thought this was an omen because W. Hartley, William Hartley, better known as Bill, was the bandmaster of the recalcitrant and discredited Victorian Central Executive and Secretary of the branch. And they thought, surely this is an omen that the Victorians, like the Titanic, were about to go down. Now, I have written once about this and made the obvious point that I doubt very much that they believed, like his namesake in 1912, that Victoria's Bill Hartley would bravely play Nearer My God to Down. But anyway, omen or not, back at the Broken Hill Civic Centre, the executive meets behind closed doors. Unfortunately, there's a very large press contingent there, about 30 yards away. So imagine I went and had a look at the siting of this. The rooms be like beyond the back wall where the federal executive was meeting, and round about where we are down the front here would be where the press corps was gathered. The problem is, you could hear the shouting in Menindee Lakes, and the part. Now, this has been hard to find, but here's a few examples that were in the press at the time. The party's federal president, Joe Chamberlain, described Clyde Cameron as the most despicable creature he had ever set eyes on. Victorian Senator Bill Brown said it made him vomit to have to sit in the same room as a man, that's Cameron, I interpolate, who was so low and such a turncoat. And I found this quite remarkable given they sat in the federal caucus together. At one stage, Bill Brown, refused to sit down at the meeting table, quote, "I want to stand down so I stand up so I can look down on this creature." And so it went on. So these shenanigans in Broken Hill become front page news around Australia. So anyway, after a tirade of accusations and abuse, eventually the federal executive sends Mick Young down to Victoria. They decide, well, Mick, you go and sort it out and see if you can prepare a report for us on the party's situation there. Now, the Victorians interpreted this, I think not unreasonably, as a very major victory. And but the next morning, comes back to luck, something occurred that changed the political history of Australia. At the boarding house where they all stayed, the federal executive members, a phone in the hall rang and was answered by the woman who was preparing breakfast in the kitchen for everyone. God knows how they ate together, but apparently they did. Anyway, she calls down the corridor that a George Crawford, just so you know, he's the president of the Victorian branch, he wanted to speak to Senator Bill Brown. Now, I'm sure he wasn't eavesdropping, but Clyde Cameron reported later that the walls of this particular boarding house were very thin. And he heard everything that was said, and so did Mick Young. So they claimed they weren't eavesdropping, but I don't know if that's right or not. But anyway, Bill Brown gave Clyde Cameron and Mick the most colossal spiteful character reference you can imagine, down the long distance phone line from the boarding house in Broken Hill. And finished off, "I've done Clyde like a dinner," he says. Unfortunately, Clyde's listening to all this, you see. Anyway, after the phone call, the bloke on the other end, George Crawford, the president of the Victorian ALP, he goes outside and briefs the press that it's all over. The meeting in Broken Hill had, quote, been a Mad Hatter's tea party. And then Bill Hartley, the secretary, rolls over the top of the parliamentary party down there and announces that the Victorian policy of phasing out state aid would stand. Well, it's a great pity for the junta, really, that controlled the Victorian ALP, that there were thin walls in that boarding house, because Clyde Cameron's retribution on behalf of Gough was swift and savage. I mean, Hartley responded by again briefing the press. Cameron, this is the national news, Cameron is off his head. He is a great dictator, and the federal executive can go to buggery. We must resist, but there can be absolutely no compromise. Well, there was absolutely no compromise. the Victorian Central Executive was rolled out in about 2 weeks, and it was all over, and a much better Labor Party emerged. Federal intervention occurred, the Victorian Central Executive was dismissed, Mick Young took charge, and the task of reconstructing the Victorian branch of the Labor Party began, and Labor began to look electable at a national level. It was a triumph for Cameron. More importantly, it was a triumph for Whitlam. Most importantly, it was a victory for Australian Labor. So I would say, comrades, as we begin this anniversary period, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the election of the Whitlam government, never forget the importance of Gough Whitlam's success in reforming the Labor Party. It was an essential precondition for the election of his government, and I would say to you it was an essential precondition for the election of subsequent Labor governments, federal and state. But we also need to remember it was Gough who was its time Prime Minister. It was Gough who swept away 23 years of Conservative government. He was the Prime Minister of free tertiary education, universal health care, Aboriginal land rights, diplomatic relations with China, rights for women and an end to conscription. That was Gough's policy. And it was Gough's achievements which stand despite the bastardry and drama of the dismissal of his government, which was the most dramatic and disgraceful event in the history of Australian politics. And I've often said that while it was Ben Chipley who evoked the light on the hill to inspire the Labor movement, it was Gough Whitlam who set aflame the light on the hill for a new generation and subsequent generations of Labor supporters. I was one of them. I'm sure many of you were also to be counted among that number. Friends, Gough's vision of a fairer, more decent, more open Australia remains a guiding light for the Australian Labor Party. Gough had absolute confidence in the reforming power of good Labor government to transform people's lives for the better. No one would disagree that he was an ambitious man. He pursued leadership. He pursued power. He pursued electoral victory. But ambition, while it's not always a virtue, is not always a vice. Gough was ambitious for himself. But he believed, of all the members of the party, of the caucus, he was best suited to lead ALP to federal victory. He was ambitious for the party. He was ambitious for Australia, for a nation at ease with itself, at ease with the world, confident, progressive, a land of uplifted potential to match our wide horizons. As I said, he was ambitious for our party as well, because he knew the Labor Party was the best party to bring about that better Australia that he strived for all his life. So I would also say that that I think you know that Gough Whitlam really stood tall in our political landscape, literally and metaphorically, of course. But he refused to be cowed or diminished by the small and mean criticism of those who saw any excuse to attack the man who brought such much needed, overdue, but viciously resisted change to Australia. I would say to you, he was courageous, he was resilient, he was determined. I really believe that he was inspiring for many. He changed our party, he made it electable, and he made it worth electing. He changed Australia for the better, and he changed Australia forever. So friends, I would say to you tonight, we should remember, as we celebrate these 50th anniversaries, Gough Whitlam was a great Australian Prime Minister. And I think with a new Labor government in office in Canberra, firmly in office in Canberra, there couldn't be a better time for us to remember and learn from and celebrate and build on Gough Whitlam's achievements and those of our party half a century ago. Thanks very much.
I don't think there's anyone who brings more passion and enjoyment into the history of the ALP than John Faulkner. You hang on every word. I'm not sure how many speeches you're doing last month and next month, John, around this topic. And everyone will be different. That's one of the joys. He always adapts the process. And you just hang off the words, and I watched the faces. You were just caught up in the passion of the joys of the ALP structure, and also the fascinating element of luck. I still cannot believe how close all those votes were, and how history could have been so easily changed. But you know, this is not a vote of thanks, John. But basically, we've got 3 speakers on our panel. Barb Williams, as always, has done extensive bios on the 3 of them, and also there's a clear NTEU stack on here, because the 3 speakers are all linked with the NTEU. I'm not going to read the long bios because you know them. They'll be able to share with you their knowledge. Sharlene Leroy-Dyer, wonderful, is a strong saltwater woman, an academic, an historian, and most importantly a unionist, which is brought out in her bio. Have a look at it, see the work she's done, the lifelong passion she has for education and for bringing forward the strengths and equity for First Nations people. So come on up. Rod Welford is already sitting up there. Rod's got a list of achievements here. I'm not going to mention any of them. No, Rod is actually, he was in State Parliament, we know that, and did some extraordinarily valuable things in State Parliament for those of us who remember him as Environment Minister and as Education Minister in a time of excitement in both of those portfolios. He was responsible for locking parliamentarians out of school visits without getting his personal approval to visit. That was great, you know, when you had to contact the Minister's office to get approval to go into a school when he was the Education Minister, which made me feel most threatened when I wanted to go in there. But I said, dear Mr. Welford. No, but in terms of the process, and he's also absolutely fabulously working with the United Nations Association at the moment, and a great link with Griffith University. And Howard Guille, my mate, Howard, we sat around the table at the QCU executive, and sometimes we were the only 2 voting one way, Howard. I remember a couple of votes like that. Mary Kelly would remember those similar experiences around the TLC table or the QCU table. Howard lives in heaven at the moment on Stradbroke Island, but he comes across the water from time to time. We know him, he writes for our journal, he's done a lot of work around labour history, but importantly with industrial relations and the work he's done with Papua New Guinea. That should always be remembered and celebrated. So that's the panel. They're going to talk, then we'll get to ask questions of the 4 people, and then we'll say thank you nicely, and then you can have some more cake. So thank you very much. In that order, I think absolutely. Up you go. No, I'm going to go, and that seems to stand up because I'm so short.
Yeah, that's fine.
Reemeen Garni, Naya Sharlene, Garigal, Durrick, Robikal, Arachri, Bayadu, Bujiri, Maiwa, Yagara Turbo, Nurawai. When Bob asked me to talk about the history of reform for First Nations peoples, I was kind of pondering what I might say, and then I wrote like a 5,000 word essay, of course because I'm an academic. And then I thought to myself, oh, I've only got 10 minutes, so I had to scrap it all and start again. But I wanted to think about the election of Albanese government and how that is going to have an effect on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I'm not sure about anybody else, but I mean, when they were elected, I had this sigh of relief. Oh my God. I know, we all did, right? Finally, after all those years of coalition, horrid governments, we had hope in sight. And we had promises of better things to come. So in his acceptance speech, Albo committed to implementing the Uluru Statement of the Heart in full, which entails a voice to Parliament, a treaty and truth-telling commission. No other election victory speech in history has placed First Nations peoples as central to the incoming government policy as Albo's did. The only other government that's undertaken such a commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples was that of Gough Whitlam. Whitlam Government had a vast and transformative reform agenda, at the heart of which was a fundamental shift in Aboriginal affairs away from an assimilation policy towards self-determination. Whitlam made it clear that Aboriginal affairs would be the priority of his government, with the establishment of the first separate Ministry for Aboriginal Affairs, and his government introduced, as John rightly said, a suite of path-breaking policies for Aboriginal people, which included land rights legislation, funding of Aboriginal legal services, the establishment of a National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, funding for Indigenous legal services, passed the Racial Discrimination Act, and he returned the lands to the Gurindji people, just to name a few things. His policy initiatives were matched by an extraordinary level of funding, much of which was directed to the critical areas of health, education, legal aid, housing and employment. Now, in the years between Whitlam and Albo, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were left in the wilderness, so to speak, with policy after policy wound back or scrapped. There were no major gains under either Labor or Liberal. Some of the low points, and I start with those because there is some high points. Drastic funding cuts to all services, the introduction of the Northern Territory Intervention, the abolition of ATSIC, the rolling back of native title laws, the watering down of land rights, the racist CDP work for the dole program, the basics card, the derailing of reconciliation, and the total rejection of the Uluru Statement of the Heart were just a few. I'm going to do some really horrible quotes from Liberals here, right? Who can remember Howard stating, "I didn't believe genocide had taken place and I still don't"? And then there was this one from Abbott, the self-appointed Minister for Indigenous Australians, who claimed there was nothing in Australia but bush before invasion, and went on to imply that the invasion of Australia was a form of foreign investment. In addition, he tried to forcibly close remote communities by stating, what we can't do is endlessly subsidise lifestyle choices if those lifestyle choices are not conducive to the kind of full participation in Australian society that everyone should have. Then we have broken promises that included compensation for the stolen generations, Hawke Government's 5 principles, 4 of which were really wound back when he caved into mining giants, the treaty we were promised but never eventuated. Let's hope Albo doesn't renege on the same promise. There were, however, some high points. Keating's Redfern speech sticks out, making him the first Prime Minister to acknowledge the impact of European invasion on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and of course, Rudd's apology to the stolen generations. But I want to come back to Albo and the current government agenda. I was fortunate to be part of the National Jobs and Skills Summit recently, and Aboriginal voices were heard, included and listened to. And to date, the Albanese government has committed to eliminating the elimination of racism in the workplace, the abolishment of the racist CDP program, the abolition of the Basics Card, and the promise of real jobs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. How far he will get remains to be seen. I hope it's all the way. However, with his government, we have a seat at the table. He has promised to consult with us, and we already have the commitment to a referendum on the voice to Parliament, so I'm feeling quite optimistic. However, there's much work to be done to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have parity in this country. For example, many of the 54 recommendations outlined in the Bringing Them Home report have still yet to be enacted. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 10 times more likely to be removed from their families at rates that have continued to rise over the last decade. More than 21,500 of our children are in out-of-home care. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are 1.2 times more likely to die in custody compared to non-Indigenous population. And although Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults make up 3% of the national population, we constitute 29% of the national prison population. We are the most incarcerated people in the world. Our labour market participation rates, job-related skills and qualifications and income are all well below those of our non-Indigenous counterparts. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment rate has improved by less than a percentage point in a decade, and we have the highest unemployment rate of any group in the Australian labour market. We are 22% more likely to be victims of crime, and the Closing the Gap targets are moving further away from success. So while we had some good funding announcements this week in the federal budget, this doesn't go anywhere near far enough. We need more than short-term fixes by successive governments. We need action, and we need it now. We need governments to listen to us, to work with us, and to implement programs with us. We have a saying in our community, nothing about us without us. Our governments need to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharlene, and I too thank Uncle Bob for his welcome to country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered. Well, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on our discussion tonight. What I'm interested in looking at is what was going on in the process that drove Gough. If we look at how he operated and what he did, what do we learn or glean from what was happening there? And I'd like to deal with that, I guess, in two phases. John is much more across the history of the Labor Party than I am. I was in year 12, driven into the Labor Party by Gough's demise in 1975. It was his final year fighting for the government's survival that inspired me in my politics. I had a bit of politics in me, stuck, imprisoned amongst all these rednecks in a private school. But I had a bit of radicalism in me, enough, at least enough to start a student progress organisation in direct competition with the official Student Representative Council, on which I typed on a manual typewriter the Constitution that prohibited the principal or staff from attending our meetings. Because we were of the students, by the students, for the students. has sort of rings about it in terms of the some of the stories that John told, doesn't it? But there were 4 points I drew out of what John said that were interesting to me and capture, in my view, some of the hallmarks of Whitlam's style, because it was his style that I followed into the party and into my own political career in many ways, and drew upon from his demonstrated experience and outstanding advocacy. The first was, John mentioned luck, and many of us in politics are not humble enough to acknowledge that luck gets us there. Most politicians think they achieved it all on their own merits. But there's this fellow called Nassim Taleb who writes about the uncertainty of life. Much of his writing is used to glean insights into the alleged machinations of financial markets, but his essential message is that our entire history, the entire history of the planet, not just of human history, turns on random events that happen that you could never predict, that change the course of history in so many ways. And John gave us some fascinating examples in our own Labor Party history that you could not have predicted, but which turned the course of the history of Labor in Australia and progressively enabled Whitlam to edge towards the government of 1972. But it could have been different. The dime could have fallen differently on any of those occasions, resulting in a different outcome, and Whitlam may have been just a blip on Labor Party history rather than one of Australia's greatest Prime Ministers. So luck, I think, is an interesting dimension of what got him to where he got to. But he built on those moments. I think that's the essence of Whitlam's drive. He was bold. We've all heard the phrase crash through or crash, and not having reflected on the history that John outlined for us tonight, I thought crash through or crash was more about the style of the government that he led. But I realised that it was his style long before he got into government. It was the style that drove him at every critical juncture of his political life, both within the party, within the parliament, and as leader of the nation. So that boldness, it's properly described, I would say, as courage, to be able to withstand that resistance, to withstand the withering criticism and still move forward. That epitomises Whitlam's character, that enabled him to get to where he got to for us as a Labor Party, but also where he took the nation. So that boldness and courage, I think, is a second dimension. The third part is hard work, and John mentioned this again. Just the sheer, prodigious industry of the man. In the lead up to 69 and 72, crafting a whole suite of new policies for the Labor Party, building that, in a sense, sophisticated policy professionalism that really, to this very day, distinguishes the Labor Party in many respects from all of the opponents. Having a policy platform that's coherent and highly developed and well thought through and extensively debated within and outside the party. And that hard work is, something I think Whitlam not only did as part of his nature, but was conscious of the need for. As he often said, the way of the reformer is hard in Australia. And he was right. It took him 20 years from his election to get to the point where he could draw us into government. And then it was only 1,071 days after that before the government was gone, but he had the energy and the capacity, the skill and the boldness and hard work to go much longer. But in that 1,071 days, look at how much of our current Australian life was set to put us on the course that we've been on since, and withstood many of the things that Conservative governments have done, that Sharlene mentioned in the meantime, and still have withstood many of those things despite their best efforts to unravel them. And the fourth element of John's historical analysis is that he made Labor electable. And something that we always have to think carefully about is, what is it in any era, whether it be 1972, 1989 for the Gough government, 1998 for the Beattie government, 2007 for the Rudd government, and this year for the Albanese government. We have to make a conscious effort to think about the policies and the communication of those policies that make Labor electable. That's not something that just happens by accident. It's something that we have to consciously work hard at. And making us electable is largely a part of the hard work on policy reform and developing our platform to reflect the needs and aspirations of the Australian people currently and into the future. So those were I think the preparatory characteristics of the Whitlam phenomenon that led to the election of the Whitlam government. And then there were some characteristics of the Whitlam government that seemed to me to be essential ways of operating as a government that makes a government more successful, that enables a government to deliver more and to achieve more. And they are these. The first is to have an abiding interest and belief that government has a real role in bettering Australian society. Not that government's just a prize to be won, a trophy to be celebrated by the incumbents of the day, or a tool to be used cynically to enrich either oneself or one's mates, which is characteristic of many Conservative governments that we've known, particularly in the history of Queensland. But that government is a real force for good and to be harnessed to achieve that good. The second thing is that to make the most of government in those terms, you have to have a party that is driven by a commitment to policy. Yes, you need good communication. Yes, you have to be able to advocate and campaign. But as Keating once said, in response to an argument about whether good policy is sometimes a contradiction to good politics, he said, good policy is good politics. And I've held that view throughout the entire political life that I've had, that good policy is good politics, and a policy-driven party is essential if government and parliamentary democracy is to be harnessed as a force for good. The third thing is that if you look at the character of Conservative governments in contrast to Labor governments, that policy foundation means that Labor governments have a discipline about how they go about implementing change. They don't do it by waking up in the morning and responding to the latest tweet or social media or Murdoch media news release and reacting during the day and then running a marketing campaign the next day. That was the Morrison way. It was an ongoing marketing circus, driven by no essential anchors in any commitment to any policy framework whatsoever. But what Whitlam taught us from what he did was to create what he called the agenda. We go to government and we go into government with a clear policy agenda, and having an agenda to follow through and implement and demonstrate to the community that change is possible and that good change benefits the Australian people is what is a clear characteristic of the Whitlam way, having a clear agenda. And the last aspect was that that agenda, when in government, was underpinned not by random opinions, not by the recalcitrant views of, itinerant politicians, but by evidence gathered and supported in the government by the numerous independent commissions of various kinds that he established. I mean, it may have been the lawyer in him, but he understood that you can't make good decisions if you don't have good evidence and information and knowledge. And he used those commissions to create that knowledge behind which the government was able to make better informed decisions. These were all characteristics of a whole framework of discipline around which Whitlam came to government and delivered government. And it's why he was able to deliver so much more in that 1,071 days that many other governments wouldn't deliver in a decade. These were things that made his government special. They're things that we look back upon with pride. They're things that subsequent politicians, except when they're faint-hearted or timorous souls, are pining to repeat, but sometimes don't have the courage to do it. The difference between Whitlam and any other government is that he wasn't just seeking to be a competent government, and everyone can form their views about whether a long or short-lasting government lacked or had elements of competence. He wasn't just seeking to be a progressive government. What he sought to be and what he was a transformative government. But he was a government for the time. He was a government at a time when Australia desperately, after decades of slumbering and slow reform, needed a transformative government. And every now and then we need a leader who transforms Australia, who shows us what it's like to be a nation that is proud and independent, outward looking and open, and understands that it has a role to play in the wider world. It's that transformative nature of Whitlam's government that stands Labor history in stark contrast to the characteristics of the Conservative governments that we've so often had to tolerate and put up with. The governments that are based essentially on another four characteristics: opportunism, cynicism in government, post-truth, saying whatever they think they need or someone else thinks need to be said, prejudice and division, using divide and conquer as their way of trying to harvest prejudice of a larger group against other groups, using the Trump approach, the Trump methodology of trying to work on the basis of people's fears and misunderstandings and lack of knowledge in order to harvest support for an us against them mentality. That's what separates Labor from that shallow and primitive and immature approach to government. We believe government's important, and we believe having an agenda that is disciplined and thoroughly thought out is what makes for good government. And we learnt that from Gough Whitlam.
Unceded Aboriginal country. My approach is going to be one of a non-parliamentary politics, one more from, I hope, more of perhaps a retired trade union view. But I couldn't resist just noting the title, Is Progressive Labour Reform Still Possible? And I thought to myself, well, if that was a debate, that topic title alone would fill the evening. Perhaps we could just start with, labourism and progress. Together, it's a very good invitation to bring out your Lenin, your Luxembourg and your Miliband and to Google the Parliamentary Road. But we'll do that another day. Look, I think up a bit.
Just a little bit closer.
Is that fine? Can you hear at the back? Thank you. Thank you. So I'm saying, so I'll forget about the Parliamentary Road. I want to start with what I believe, just to define, are the two dominant overriding issues of current politics. And I think the first is a settlement with First Nations people, and second, a settlement with the planet and with other sentient species. And again, the evidence and the documentation for that, I think, is absolutely clear. Now, I'm going to set aside matters about the shape of those settlements. What I want to concentrate on is whether our politics are capable of bringing off such settlements. And to bring off a political settlement essentially needs two main things. First, it requires that we make progressive ideas what Galbraith termed the orthodox or conventional wisdom. We need, as a matter of course, people they think progressively, which is, I think both previous speakers and John have both said, is something a long way off at the moment. But second, as well as making progressive ideas the dominant ideas, it requires a long period of holding the levers of state and the levers of social power and authority. It needs two things. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that, and John Faulkner, I think, said this at the beginning of his speech, that the two things that Whitlam brought, and I think the two things which are essential for progressive politics, are democracy and equality. And, for example, a settlement with First Nations peoples requires non-Aboriginal people to decolonise. It requires them to approach everything as saying, we want equality with you and this is what we are prepared to do that. Likewise, similarly, a settlement with the planet on climate change, reversing the accelerating ecological destruction, requires, in my view, a material equality of outcomes and conditions. Now, and the reason for that is much of the current climate and environmental action, the so-called positive action, is actually exaggerating extant inequalities. It may be doing something for the environment, but at the same time it's making inequalities worse. For example, we accept there should not be subsidies for fossil fuel producers. If a reactionary government like the British government can bring in a super profits tax on gas, I would have hoped that a Labour government could in Australia. But they're only part of it. The other things, if we look at feed-in tariffs for rooftop solar, the tax incentives that we will inevitably get so that people can purchase electric vehicles, they will give more benefit to the already privileged than to the disadvantaged. So we need to put democracy and equality at the centre of those settlements that we're looking for. But I want to go a stage further than that. I also want to suggest that a couple of values and precepts which I believe are fundamental to both First Nations people and to at least some part of the trade union movement are also important. And those are the principles of collectivism and solidarity. Now, one of the things that's I think, not given anything like the recognition it should be in Australia and the wider Pacific, is that collective and shared land ownership is a central part of Aboriginal and Maori societies and right through the Pacific Islands. And we don't give that enough credence. It builds into some of the policies on native title, not always to the best, but it's something that we need to give more credence to. I'll just give you a very simple example. Claire made a very polite remark about my involvement in Papua New Guinea with the unions. It is very interesting, the last time I was up there, that the local landowners in Gila province, which is the site of ExxonMobil's LNG production, the local landowners had a dispute about the amount of royalties that they were getting. They didn't think 30% was sufficient. Compare that with Australia, by the way. This was the local landowners. So they looked for representation. And they were represented by the Papua New Guinea Maritime Union to represent them in their dealings with ExxonMobil. And they got the royalties lifted. So the links are there if we start to look for them. Similarly, if we look, Queensland Government last week or the week before is now spruiking the crucial role of publicly owned electricity assets. And I saw Dan Andrews doing something similar, I think, the other day. In responding to climate change, we need collective ownership of these assets. It's a pity about the railways, which were privatised. But collectivism is back on the agenda in all kinds of ways. And we can also, I think, take things from the sense of solidarity. In what we might call old style unionism, solidarity is fundamentally, I think, about three things. One, preventing a race to the bottom. Two, lifting the floor, be it minimum wages, be it proper equal pay and remuneration for women. And three, using the strong to ensure that material conditions are lifted for everybody and fairly distributed. And I remember many hours of listening to Bill Kelty in this room talking about that back in the late 80s and early 90s. And to go to something as conservative as the International Labour Organization, which is a tripartite body, it has always had the precept, the continuing principle. One, that labour is not a commodity, and two, that poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. Now, let's bring those things back into the policy development and the political debate if we wish to see progressive reform. I'm suggesting that it's essential that we cultivate these again in order to be progressive. But if we are going to cultivate them again, I'm going to suggest, and this will perhaps be more contentious, that there are two fundamental areas that we need to address. The first is controlling the market, and second is that we need to tackle wealth. The two big fundamental problems in Australia are the extent to which we've allowed market to make decisions, and second, the extent to which we've allowed inequality of wealth, of income to widen. And just one figure alone, we have a worse inequality in wage distribution of the OECD. We are worse than the United States in terms of the distribution of wage incomes. Now, and in part it is self-inflicted. And I've one very good comparison of this, and not to compare that I would have liked to have done perhaps the Whitlam government and the Rudd government, but you wouldn't get very far in any positives on the second one. The notion of, let's compare two very important governments, the Curtin-Chifley government with the Hawke-Keating government. And we can do so because both of them issued white papers on employment. And indeed, it's relevant because the Albanese government has announced that it will have a white paper on employment by next year. In 1945, the famous white paper on full employment was issued, and it states at clause 3, in peacetime, the responsibility of Commonwealth and state governments is to provide the general framework of a full employment economy. That was a commitment. In 1994, the author, or the primary author of the Full Employment White Paper, Nugget Coombs, compared the Curtin White Paper with the Keating Employment White Paper. And it's a very illuminating comparison. I'll just draw two quotes from it, from Coombs's work in 1994. The first one he says, and he's talking about the Keating one, the extent to which he says they have allowed the market to take over. And he says, quote, no challenge was mounted to the dominance of the hard-line commitment to the dictates of the market. And continuing, our business leaders, our ministers and their advisors respond to the dictates of a market which is increasingly dominated by external interests. So he bells the cat beautifully. And I just note that, of course, was before national competition policy and the new public sector management, both of which brought those in spades into the economy and into politics. Coombs also says we must pause and reflect. We need to reconsider. We need to pause and reflect, and he said we must open up knowledge and ideas. And I will almost leave you with those 2 points. We must pause and reflect. We must open up knowledge and ideas. But I'll just give you, can't resist, 3 reasons about what we might wish on a practical level to pause and reflect. It is not by chance that the market in the Murray-Darling Basin has substituted wide-ranging production of almonds, which are returning 30% on capital to superannuation funds from the United States and 15% returns on market trading to the water brokers of Wall Street. That's come from the deregulation and the pricing of water in the Murray-Darling. It's not by chance that our environmental impact statement processes, such as the one for Toondah Harbour that I'm working on, or our coal mine approval processes in Queensland, have been corrupted by the market and by consultants. And it's not by chance, I understand, that 25% of the Building Better Regions funding, which thank goodness was abolished yesterday, that 25% of that goes into the pockets of the top 4 management consultants for preparing submissions and evaluating submissions. I would just say I've never been more shocked in my union political life. I was doing some work for a Aboriginal land corporation, some of you will know which one, when we were asked to make an application for a Building Better Regions grant to build a cultural centre. It required us to produce a what's called cost-benefit analysis. Now, I have done quite a lot of those. I'm reasonably well qualified. However, we were advised by the Regional Development Agency that we would stand a much better chance if we employed one of the top 4 management consultants to produce that cost-benefit analysis for us. So myself and the other person working with me handed our numbers over to PricewaterhouseCoopers. Somebody signed a big check, and we got our numbers written up under a PricewaterhouseCoopers label. The project was then evaluated by another management consultancy company, and we didn't get the money. However, but we're back. Those aspects of the market are everywhere. Now, I'll end on this, and it goes back, in fact, I think, to the point that all previous 3 speakers have made. And this is the pragmatic trade unions. Let's put the theory aside and come back. It isn't about international socialism. There's 2 things I want to, 2 points to end on. One, all the high-minded values in the world are worthless if a government can't keep the lights on. So, a government has got to be competent. I think that's the first point. And second, and I'll just leave you with a quote from a very non-progressive political theorist called Max Weber that some of you will have heard of. Max Weber said that politics is hard, as I think all the previous 3 speakers have said, but he put it much nicer than that. He said, politics is about the strong and slow boring of hard boards. The strong and slow boring of hard boards. I'd just add one thing to that. If the drill battery gets low, it gets even harder. Thank you very much.
Thank you to those speakers. We have a bit of time for questions, so who would like to be the first to ask a question? Nobody?
I'll make a comment.
Can everybody rush?
You'll make a comment, yes.
My question is to Cheryl.
Sharlene.
Sharlene, sorry. In attending the Jobs Summit that you did, I'm pleased you got the response that you did, but I just wonder whether there was any discussion around raising the age of criminal responsibility in the context of you talking about the enormous percentages of incarceration, particularly of young Indigenous kids.
There was talk about it.
Sorry.
I give the speakers a mic because we can't hear the question.
Okay. Would you like to come up?
Question to Sharlene in relation to her having attended the summit in Canberra just recently. Was there any discussion in relation to raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14? Particularly in relation to the high percentage of Indigenous children that are in incarceration.
Get up from the mic. Yeah, so there was a very small amount of talk about it, but I know that there is a national campaign that's following on from that. And I had a discussion with someone tonight about it. Yeah, so there's going to be lots of follow-up, and I know that within the Aboriginal community there is a really big push for it. So,
Thank you.
Adrian?
Yeah, just got a question. Like, when you look at the extraordinary qualities of this government, it seems like the initial answer has to do with looking at the machinations of stuff within the ALP and of the qualities of the man, which are undeniable. But there's not much attention paid to the huge social movements that preceded that government, which I would argue, if you look at the stuff that was done in terms of land rights, of higher education, and all those things that were really significant, that framework for reform was created already on the streets and campuses, and really powerful social movements. I think we end up with a really diminished understanding of the era if we don't put it in that proper context, and we just have this kind of idolatry towards this individual man.
Good question.
I think that's true, by the way, and not the idolatry, but there is no doubt that the 1960s, there was huge change in society. I recently did something, for example, talking about the Labour Party and Australian politics of 1968, and was asked about what was happening on the international stage. Look what was happening in Paris. There were 2 major assassinations in the United States of America, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. There was a very significant event at the Olympic Games, the Prague Spring, and then the invasion of Czechoslovakia. You can go on and on. And what I would say to you is this: that is true. Society was changing. There was a huge amount of change and modernisation as well. And what Whitlam did, I think it is fair to say, he reflected much of that movement in the Australian community. There was, as you know, very significant national protests around the Vietnam War. You can go on and on. This was reflected by a evolving Labour Party leadership at the time, and I think it is fair to say that many in the Australian community saw Whitlam and the Labour Party of those years much more in touch with these huge changes in Australian society. The place of women, the issues in relation to the standing of Indigenous Australians in our community. It goes on and on. So I think the point that you make is absolutely fair. It's absolutely accurate. But I think it's also fair to say that at the time that Whitlam was very sensitive to these changes and he reflected them. You see, he was part of that movement himself. He was was in common cause with those movements, and I think that's also a fair thing to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to support the point you made about
Can you
what was
speak
going
up?
on. All right. Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to support the point that's just been made about the importance of what was going on around the politicians, because the context is just so important. And to develop that point very quickly, there's some comments made about the role of luck in politics, right? Role of chance. And you probably won't disagree with what I'm going to say, but if there isn't something that happens, if the right people and the right movement are in the right place at the right time, you can turn it to your advantage. And it's not luck that we've had a pandemic. That pandemic has been the result of like a complex set of political, social, and environmental conditions. It's not luck that people's houses get flooded. It's because they're built for profit by developers in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And look, it's fair to say a lot of this is contextual. One thing I do at the moment, I have for many years, chaired the Whitlam Institute. And we conducted a symposium last Friday, just a few days ago, and we had 2 papers prepared for them, not about what was happening in the Whitlam government, but what Australian society was like in the 1960s. And I commend to you, please have a look at it, a paper from Professor Frank Bongiorno, who I think it is fair to say now is, with the death of Stuart McIntyre, the Australia's leading Labour historian, and then a paper by Jenny Hocking on events in the lead up to the election of the Whitlam government. We very much understand the context of the times. So I'd commend those, and very soon, they're very substantial papers, and they'll be available for access on our Whitlam Institute website. But the point I'm trying to make there is that rest assured, this point is crucial as we look at the political developments of the time, the broader cultural and community context of these, both, I think it is fair to say, nationally and internationally.
Howard and I want to supplement that. I agree with John that context is relevant and important, and the sentiment of social change in the 60s was writ large, not just in Australia but around the world. But a point I'd make is this, and I make this to lots of people who, and you've all heard them, say, oh, all the parties are the same. They're all the same. You know, they're no different. Labor's no different to Liberal. Well, the point I make is this. All that social upheaval, all that social activism, all those social movements could have occurred right throughout the 60s and continued to occur throughout the 70s, but for a Whitlam government. That's my point. We've just had, and I'll give you, want to get an analogy, we've just had a decade of a government that sat on its hands while the world of renewable energy and climate change action changed around it. And if that government was still here, we still wouldn't be doing anything about it. Nothing would have changed in Australia in the 70s if Whitlam hadn't been elected. We'd have still had Conservative governments suppressing and ignoring and trying to divert attention from those social movements, as powerful and as active as they were. And I knew lots of people, and John was part of it, and I knew lots of people slightly older than me who were in the streets and part of it as well. And you know, we all were supportive of it. But I guess my point is that Whitlam was not just the conduit for that social reform and sentiment. He unleashed it with the power of government. And unless you get into government and unleash that opportunity for real social reform in policy change, without a change in government, you can't change the country.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be quite deviant. I actually think Australia in the 1960s was very conservative.
Yes.
I mean, I think that we're in danger of erecting myths. You know, we didn't let in other than white migrants, and we tested them. I mean, this may shock you. I don't want to say how I found out, but a potential European migrant to Australia had to have a medical. One of the questions on the medical form was, what is the colour of the skin? And that was in the 1960s. And similarly, you know, in my view, a lot of trade unions were very conservative. There wasn't much action in the workplace, despite the highest levels of union membership. There wasn't that much action to promote non-male people, whether they were women or whether they were non-white males. So I think we were much more conservative. And indeed, intellectually, we were terribly conservative. We were terribly conservative. We did not have the links with the European thinkers that were involved in the movements in France or the movements in Sweden. We didn't have those links. So I think we just be very careful that we're not over exaggerating just how prominent it was.
I'm not looking for to come up here, Dan. Sorry. Do you want to come up here and use the microphone?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think you can go a bit far in that kind of scepticism about the Australian 60s movement, but that's not the main point I want to make. I agree that you'd be a fool in the present circumstances in Australia if you weren't voting for the Labor Party. But I think you can also exaggerate the relationship of the Labor Party to vast social movements that have occurred several times in Australia, and most significantly in the 60s and the early 70s. It's all very well to say that Whitlam expressed that, but there's also the truth that Whitlam contained that. I mean, just to give one outrageous possibility that probably couldn't have occurred, but I still think about it. At the time when Whitlam was dismissed, and if you look into the background of the dismissal and consider the involvement, the possible involvement of the CIA, and if you think of the forces that led to the dismissal, how come it never occurred to anyone that one could have simply said, not maintain your age, go and vote, but we're not leaving? Suppose that at that point, Whitlam, or the Labor Party, had been considering less the need to have a form of protest that maintained the possibility of their continuing careers. If they'd said, this is a watershed in the history of this country, and if we make a declaration that is sufficiently radical, we can change the nature of this country and its history forever. I still frequently think about what might have happened had that occurred.
Well, I mean, I'll respond to it. I wish that were true, but look, Labor went to an election and was smashed.
Exactly.
We went to an election 2 years later under Gough's leadership, and we were smashed. You've got to just be realistic about this. One thing, at the absolute fundamental for Gough was he believed that the only way to change Australia was to win government. You can't do it any other way. And he's right about that. He was right about that. At the end of the day, you actually had to win. So what he does is, he spends a political career making the Labor Party electable. We haven't I didn't talk at all, Rob touched on it briefly. I mean, the amount of work that goes into policy development, the use of outside experts, getting that in place for 1972, the changes to the Labor Party over so many years. All this was necessary for have building blocks for the primary imperative of winning government. He believed, now not everyone does, but he believed, and I agree with this, you can only achieve that sort of change in our society by changing governments. And yes, he was a believer in the democratic process. And some may think that's a weakness. Personally, I think it's a strength. But that is my view. But understand this his fundamental argument to the party and the Australian people was for change, major change, progressive change, a more equal and fairer Australia, which we all support, a better Australia, and to do that you actually had to win an election and put into place your policies and put into place your program for government. The party, of course, he had those three elements, the party, the policy and the people. That was the Whitlam strategy, and fundamentally it worked, but there were many problems, including the fact that he had 92 bills blocked in the Australian Senate. Then, of course, calls an election, wins it, and goes back on fundamental issues like fairer elections, like Medibank, successfully achieved through a joint sitting. These are tough things to do. No one else has ever managed to do that in Australian politics, and I think it's important that everyone understands that that was his ambition for Australia, and that was his methodology of reform. I don't ask everyone to embrace it, but that's what his view was. And the reason we all wanted Anthony to win a few months ago is precisely that. You can do bugger all in opposition. That's the truth. You've actually got to win an election and then make it count.
We've only got time for a couple more. Anne, and then, Les.
I'll have to use the microphone. I haven't got a voice.
That's all right.
I just wanted to say I don't think that we have to see these things in competition with one another. There has to be social demonstration and resistance and all the things that are necessary. But there also has to be governments that are capable of changing things and making reforms. So just to give you an example, here in Queensland, in the 1980s, you may recall, we had a fairly hideous premier, and we'd had him for a very long time, and the Labor Party had been out of government for 32 years, and you know, things were looking pretty grim. And then he made the mistake one day of getting up in the morning and saying, oh well, the day of the street march is over, don't bother to apply for a permit, you won't get one. Whereupon everybody suddenly realised that they had to march. So there was a pretty long and extensive campaign on the streets of Queensland demanding the right to march. Now, the right to march is a fairly esoteric kind of democratic right, but nevertheless, what that did was it brought a whole load of people who didn't know each other before together on the streets talking about politics. Some of them were in the Labor Party, some of them were not. They actually did have a fairly strenuous debate about what was the way to go and whether or not it was possible to get any kind of reform. That debate strengthened those forces of reform within the Labor Party, because we'd all been banned from talking to other branches within the Labor Party. But then we all met in King George Square and went to the pub afterwards and developed the reform group within the Labor Party and the Socialist Left within the Labor Party, and a whole range of other things that came out of that human activity of coming together to talk about politics. And that needs to be done in a whole range of areas, on the streets, in the party room, in the parliament, and everywhere. And these things aren't in competition, and they're not unrelated. It wasn't an accident that Wayne Gough won in 1989. A whole load of people have gone to jail for that. He bailed them out. But nevertheless, that's my
No? Okay. Les.
Very good topic, very interesting.
comments from everyone on this, and particularly thank John for that history and Sharlene talking about the Indigenous thing. I wanted to speak to actually highlight that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the First Nations, I don't like being called Indigenous Australian, the politics is a little bit different in the sense that, yes, we are very supportive of Labor and so on and go on, but we can't afford to be caught up in a political alignment based upon partisan politics in the Australian government. And I think we're getting closer to understanding that, which I'll mention in a minute. But the Whitlam years did change everything for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. He came in with a policy of saying it's the national government that should be responsible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. Before it was the responsibility of the colonies, which became states. So that was the first thing he did. And he then brought to attention the fact that there needed to be a minister in a department dedicated to all that, and created the NACC, National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had a voice. The policy was self-determination. You don't hear that word much nowadays. We've gone through 50 years, and even the voice to Parliament is not self-determination. If you're advising a government, you're not being self-determining, and I don't support it going into the Constitution. So I'll just finish up talking about the Constitution, in that what's being pointed out now over the politics, the ups and downs and ins and outs, and particularly established by Whitlam and the Whitlam government, which has not been lived up to date with any of the governments. We've tried to get support from Labor, and Keating did a good job with his Redfern speech. And sorry, I'll give credit to Hawke for the ATSIC, for the commission, which was run by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But the word is there now. We look like a referendum next year. What the government is saying is that the Constitution of Australia is not appropriate for government, right? For government in Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and rights and so on have to be taken into account some way. But by putting a voice in there is not the right way to do it. I'll be writing more about that after the 2nd of December when we start thinking 50 years back. But the whole thing is that the Constitution was basically the way that God arrived on the shores in the name of the Crown in 1788 and told us the way things will be, taking all the lands, territories and resources. Right? That has to change. The Constitution still captures that. And for us to get justice, every road now still points back to the Constitution, the parliaments and the courts. You know, we have to have a voice to the Parliament. They don't have to obey us, they haven't a lot of times, and so on. But it's not going to be enough just simply having in the Constitution there shall be a voice. It needs more than that. I think I've talked long enough, but I think it's a very important thing that, to me, the Whitlam years are the benchmark. And while we've had some things happening since then, particularly under a Labor government, we haven't got the benchmark. We haven't got it in place. And that's something I think when we compare Whitlam and talk about Albanese, and I hope Albanese is the reformist government that it appears to be, that some of those things that were established back in 1972 are put in place now. National responsibility for Aboriginal affairs, not states and territories. I mean, they're talking about treaties and all constitutional changes and everything else, but national responsibility, the rights, which is currently being looked at by the federal parliament, the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, hopefully will have a result, not just be another committee inquiry, and that we are able to have our own representative body. I was actually national co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples for the first 2 terms of that. It was a company owned by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The representatives were elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Among its 5 purposes included advising Parliament on matters, but the main purpose was to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in Australia, to help development, foster development, and so on with all that. Sorry to be so long-winded about it all, but I just wanted to try and point out how important those Whitlam years were, and that we have not lived up to it. We have not lived up to it in successive governments, and hopefully we can get there this time. Thank you.
Okay, John, would you come up and give a vote of thanks?
Hi everybody, for those of you who don't know me, I'm John McCullough. I'm the convener of Vintage Reds, which Craig is standing in front of our poster there. Do you want to start? It's my pleasure to move the vote of thanks for the participants in this evening's very enlightening forum, starting, I think, with Uncle Bob. Thank you so much for your welcome to country and for your long service to the union movement. You are a much admired man by everyone in this room, and we're very fortunate to have you here tonight. I'd also like to thank Senator Claire Moore for acting as the chair, and I'd also like to mention that Claire was the secret agent that we had employed to talk John Faulkner into coming along this evening, and we're very grateful for her efforts in doing that. Of course, I'd like to thank the three panelists that we've had, Sharlene Leroy-Dyer, Rob Welford, and Howard Guille. All three of your contributions are much valued. Thank you very much. That leaves me to thank John Faulkner. Brings an immense amount of knowledge and a lot of passion to his presentations, and it's always a real pleasure to hear you speak on labor history. Thank you so much. At this stage, I'm supposed to give a plug to the two sponsoring organizations. I've already mentioned that Vintage Reds is one of them. We've got our little leaflet here on the back table. If you're not aware of us as an organization, please take a leaflet. We meet here at the QCU on the first Thursday of every month. We also participate in a number of rallies and picket lines. So if you want to get some exercise, you can wave a sign with us. The other sponsoring organization is the Brisbane Labour History Association, which Greg is representing, and they've got some literature at the back as well. I believe there's still some food left on the table, and so I invite you all to have a cup of coffee and and perhaps some refreshments as well as you leave. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to thank the Vintage Reds on behalf of the Brisbane Labour History Association. I'd like to thank Vintage Reds for the excellent food that they provided. Thank you.